Picture a world where dragons lurk at the edges of uncharted seas, where mountains hide the gates to paradise, and entire continents are drawn from whispered legends rather than measured footsteps. This wasn't just fantasy, it was reality on the maps of our ancestors. These ancient cartographic masterpieces weren't merely guides for travelers. They were vivid tapestries woven from equal parts observation and imagination, reflecting the deepest hopes, fears, and mysteries of the civilizations that created them. What if I told you that every sea serpent sketched in the margins and every phantom island inked onto parchment holds a story far richer than simple geography? These maps are more than directions, they're time capsules, preserving how entire cultures made sense of a world still largely unknown to them. Think about the courage it took to draw a map when so much of the Earth was still blank space. Without satellites or precise instruments, cartographers filled the voids with the only things they had: stories. A sailor's tale of mermaids became a warning in the waves. A traveler's account of a golden city transformed into a dotted line leading to El Dorado. These weren't mistakes, they were declarations of belief, and that's what makes ancient maps so mesmerizing. They don't just show us where people thought lands were, they reveal how people thought the world worked. From the intricate Imago Mundi of medieval Europe, where Jerusalem sat at the center of a spiritual cosmos, to the Chinese charts that balanced earthly realms with celestial harmony, every stroke of the quill was an act of meaning-making. So today, we're setting sail on a journey through these extraordinary documents, not just as historians, but as detectives piecing together the worldview of lost eras. We'll uncover why medieval maps placed monsters at the edges of the known world, how Pacific navigators charted oceans using only the stars and stories passed down for generations, and what happens when geography collides with mythology. Along the way, you'll see how these maps shaped exploration, fueled empires, and even sparked wars over lands that never existed. But most importantly, you'll discover what they tell us about humanity's endless drive to make sense of the unknown. Because every time an ancient cartographer drew a line into the void, they weren't just mapping the Earth, they were mapping the human spirit, ready to decode these secrets together. Let's begin. Long before compasses or satellites, the very first maps emerged not from precise measurements but from human wonder. The Babylonians pressed cuneiform symbols into clay tablets over 2,500 years ago, sketching a world where their empire stood at the center, encircled by a ring of bitter waters and mythical lands beyond. Their Imago Mundi, now cracked with age but still legible, shows Babylon as a rectangle bisected by the Euphrates, with distant territories like Assyria and Urartu reduced to mere labels floating in the void. This wasn't geography as we know it. It was a diagram of belief, a cosmic order where civilization ended where knowledge did. Meanwhile, along the Nile, Egyptian scribes drew maps for far more practical reasons, to mark property boundaries after annual floods washed away landmarks. But even their pragmatic sketches held deeper meaning. A famous papyrus from the reign of Ramses IV plots a quarry route through the eastern desert, but tucked between wadis and hills are symbols of the gods guarding the journey. For these early cultures, the physical and spiritual worlds weren't separate. A river wasn't just water, it was the vein of a deity. A mountain wasn't rock, it was the throne of the heavens. These ancient mapmakers faced a challenge we can hardly fathom today: how to depict a world they'd only experienced in fragments. When Babylonian traders returned from distant ports with tales of forests where trees touched the sky, or Egyptian explorers spoke of deserts that burned like copper under the sun, Cartographers had to decide, were these places real or were they metaphors? The answer was often both. The edges of their maps dissolved into zigzag lines representing chaos or serpentine beasts coiled in uncharted waters. These weren't decorations, they were honest admissions of the unknown. What's extraordinary is how these early attempts set the template for centuries to come. The Babylonian idea of a world surrounded by ocean echoes in later Greek maps. The Egyptian habit of placing sacred sites at the center of their landscapes foreshadows medieval Christian Mappa Mundi. Even their mistakes were generative. When Ptolemy drew his groundbreaking geography centuries later, he relied on Babylonian estimates of Earth's size that were wildly off, yet his work guided explorers for over 1,000 years. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson from these primordial maps. They remind us that every act of cartography is an act of storytelling. The clay tablets and papyrus scrolls didn't just record space, they encoded values. Who mattered enough to be placed at the center? What terrors lurked in the margins? The answers tell us less about the shape of the earth and more about the shape of the human mind, always reaching, always guessing, and always hungry to make the unknown feel just a little more like home. To the medieval mind, a map was never just paper and ink. It was a mirror of the divine. Take the Hereford Mappa Mundi, created around the year 1300. Its calfskin parchment stretching 5 feet tall. At first glance, it looks like a chaotic collage. Cities squashed together, rivers bending unnaturally, oceans teeming with sea monsters. But this wasn't a failure of geography. It was a triumph of faith. Jerusalem sits precisely at the center, not because it was geographically middlemost, but because it was the spiritual heart of Christendom. The Red Sea bleeds bright scarlet, not for accuracy, but to commemorate Moses parting its waters. Even the bizarre creatures lurking at the edges, men with dog heads, tribes of one-footed beings, served a purpose. These weren't cartographic errors, they were moral signposts, reminding viewers that the farther one strayed from holy lands, the stranger and more perilous the world became. Islamic maps took a radically different approach, yet shared this sacred purpose. Scholars like Al-Idrisi, working in the court of Sicily's Norman king Roger II, produced maps that pointed southward. Why? Because Mecca lay to the southeast of Europe, and aligning maps this way allowed Muslims to orient themselves toward the Qibla during prayer. Their maps often depicted the earth as a circle divided by mountain ranges and seas, not unlike the descriptions in the Quran. Rivers flowed from paradise itself, reinforcing the idea that geography was an extension of divine creation. Accuracy mattered less than alignment with sacred texts. When Al-Idrisi's maps showed the Nile beginning in the mountains of the moon, it wasn't a guess, it was a nod to ancient Islamic cosmology. What's striking is how both traditions, though visually worlds apart, shared a core belief. Maps existed to reveal God's design, not man's discoveries. The Christian Mappa Mundi often framed the earth within Christ's outstretched arms, while Islamic maps sometimes included the unseen realms of jinn and angels. These weren't decorative flourishes, they were visual sermons. Even the blank spaces held meaning. On the Hereford map, the words "Hic sunt dracones," here be dragons, marked more than uncharted territory. They signaled the limits of human understanding, a boundary where faith began. And then there were the bridges between worlds, literally. Some medieval maps depicted the earth as a series of concentric circles, with Jerusalem as the gateway between earthly and heavenly realms. Islamic cartographers drew the legendary barzakh, a barrier separating the mortal world from the hereafter. These features made the maps functional in ways we'd never expect today. Pilgrims traced routes not just with their fingers but with prayers. Scholars studied them less for navigation and more for meditation. seeing in their lines the fingerprints of the divine. Yet for all their holiness, these maps also harbored whispers of the fantastical. Just beyond the orderly cities and sacred rivers, the parchment gave way to the extraordinary fountains of youth, lands where the sun never set, even the occasional dragon curled around an island. These elements weren't contradictions of the sacred, they were extensions of it. If God's creation was infinite, why couldn't it include marvels beyond human comprehension? The line between miracle and myth blurred willingly, leaving room for wonders that would later fuel the age of exploration. Because when your map is already a testament to the divine, what's one more mystery in the margins? Monsters didn't just lurk in the shadows of ancient maps, they thrived there, coiled around coastlines, perched on mountain peaks, even sunning themselves on phantom islands. These weren't idle doodles, they were the visual language of human anxiety. Take the Hereford Mapper Mundi's menagerie, a cyclops glaring from the Caucasus, a cyapod shielding itself with its single giant foot, a tribe of headless humans with faces embedded in their chests. To modern eyes, these seem like whimsy, but to medieval viewers, they were warnings. Each creature symbolized a moral or spiritual boundary. The farther from Jerusalem, the more deformed the inhabitants, a cartographic echo of the belief that virtue diminished with distance from holy ground. The oceans especially became stages for terror. Whirlpools large enough to swallow fleets, sea serpents with coils as thick as castle towers, even fish that breathed fire, all found their way onto maps. The infamous Carta Marina of 1539 didn't just include sea monsters, it catalogued them like a field guide, labeling each with names like Prister or Orca, turning fear into taxonomy. Sailors' tales of these beasts weren't dismissed as superstition, they were treated as vital intelligence. When Olaus Magnus drew a kraken dragging sailors to their doom off Norway's coast, he was preserving local lore that had guided mariners for generations. These creatures weren't just hazards, they were explanations. A sudden storm became the thrashing of Leviathan, a ship lost without trace, clearly snatched by tentacles from the deep. Yet not all map monsters were omens of doom. Some hinted at wonder. The island of Thule, first mentioned by the Greek explorer Pytheas in the 4th century BCE, appeared on maps for over 1,000 years as a place where the sea congealed into ice and the sun barely set. Was it Iceland, Greenland, a mirage? No one knew, but its persistence on charts reveals something profound: the human craving for edges. Thule wasn't just a location, it was a challenge. Explorers from the Romans to the Elizabethans sought it, not because they believed in its icy marvels, but because its very uncertainty dared them to look further. The most fascinating thing about these mythical elements is how they bled into reality. When medieval maps showed the kingdom of Prester John, a Christian utopia hidden somewhere in Africa or Asia, it wasn't just fantasy. It fueled actual expeditions. Prince Henry the Navigator sent ships down Africa's coast partly to find it. Even Columbus carried maps speckled with phantom islands, convincing himself he'd spotted them in the Caribbean. The line between legend and discovery was porous. For centuries, maps didn't just reflect exploration, they scripted it, turning whispers into waypoints and nightmares into navigational aids. So the next time you see a dragon curled at the edge of an old parchment, remember, that creature wasn't just filling space. It was holding a mirror to the cartographer's soul, showing us what they feared, what they revered, and how fiercely they longed to make sense of a world still brimming with mystery. And as we'll soon see, that longing didn't just shape maps, it shaped history, sending ships into uncharted waters with nothing but ancient myths as their guides. Beyond the known world's borders, ancient maps whispered of realms where the rules of nature unraveled. The Pillars of Hercules marking the Strait of Gibraltar weren't just geographic features, they were a psychological barrier, a gateway to the unknown. Roman sailors spoke of them as the limit of civilized existence, beyond which lay the Mare Tenebrosum, the Sea of Darkness. This wasn't merely a poetic name, it was a warning. Medieval Arab geographers like al-Masudi described these waters as boiling under eternal storms, where compasses spun wildly and ships vanished without trace. Yet for all its terrors, this edge exerted an irresistible pull. The very phrase non plus ultra, nothing further beyond, inscribed on early maps, became a challenge to explorers. Columbus himself carried this duality in his heart, fearing the sea's wrath while chasing the promise of what lay beyond it. These edges weren't blank spaces, they were canvases for humanity's deepest anxieties and aspirations. The Hereford mapper Mundi's outer rings teemed with grotesque creatures, but look closer, and you'll find paradise too. The Garden of Eden often appeared at the world's fringe, a tantalizing counterpoint to the monsters. This duality reveals a profound truth. The unknown terrified civilizations, but it also enchanted them. When Norse maps marked the ocean west of Greenland as the place where the giants dwell, they weren't just deterring sailors, they were preserving a sense of wonder. Even the scientific-minded Ptolemy couldn't resist sketching the antipodes, a hypothetical land where people walked upside down, a concept that haunted European imagination for centuries. What's most fascinating is how these edges shaped real-world decisions. The Mare Tenebrosum's reputation delayed Atlantic exploration for generations, while the myth of the Green Sea of Darkness, a zone of perpetual night south of the equator, nearly stopped Portuguese sailors from rounding Africa. Yet the same myths that instilled fear also fueled ambition. The Azores appeared on 14th century maps as the Isles of the Blessed, a Celtic afterlife myth that became a navigational target. These weren't just mistakes, they were motivational tools turning folklore into coordinates. And then there were the deliberate deceptions. Some edges existed not because the world ended, but because someone wanted you to think it did. The Venetian Zeno map of the 1400s invented an entire island chain, Frisland, to control trade routes. Arab cartographers sometimes exaggerated the Indian Ocean's eastern reach to deter rivals. Even Ptolemy's insistence that the Indian Ocean was landlocked wasn't an error. It was a strategic choice, discouraging southern exploration to protect trade monopolies. These edges were as much about power as they were about perception, proving that the world's boundaries weren't just discovered, they were designed. This dance between fear and fascination at the map's edge reveals something timeless about human nature. We still create borders, not just on land, but in space and digital realms, and fill them with modern monsters and marvels. The difference is that today we call them dark matter or the deep web instead of Leviathan or the Isles of Demons, but the impulse remains the same, to mark the limits of our understanding, then inch beyond them. And just as ancient sailors braved the Mare Tenebrosum with nothing but parchment myths as guides, we too push forward, lured by the same blend of terror and wonder that once crowded the edges of crumbling maps. Frauds and fantasies didn't just creep into ancient maps by accident, some were planted there with deliberate cunning. Take the infamous Vinland Map, a parchment that sent shockwaves through the historical community when it surfaced in the 1950s. Here was a document that seemed to rewrite history, depicting part of North America's coastline labeled as Vinland alongside Norse script, suggesting Viking explorers had charted the New World long before Columbus. The implications were staggering until scientists noticed something odd. The ink contained anatase, a titanium compound not used in medieval pigments but common in 20th century inks. The map was a masterful fake, likely crafted to bolster Scandinavian claims to early exploration glory. But why would anyone go to such lengths? The motives behind these cartographic deceptions were as varied as the maps themselves. National pride often fueled them, like the Zeno map's Phantom Island of Friesland, concocted by Venetian brothers to exaggerate their ancestors' seafaring prowess. Financial gain drove others. Medieval portolan charts sometimes included fake hazards to steer rival traders away from lucrative routes. Even religion played a role. Some mapmakers altered Holy Land geography to make pilgrimage sites align with biblical narratives. These weren't simple lies, they were strategic manipulations, bending perception to serve power, profit, or propaganda. Modern technology has unraveled many of these schemes with forensic precision. X-ray fluorescence scans detect anomalous inks. Multispectral imaging reveals erased corrections beneath surfaces. Even the paper itself tells tales. The Vinland Map's wormholes didn't match its supposed companion manuscripts. Yet the most fascinating forgeries aren't those that were wholly invented, but those that blended truth with trickery. The Waldseemüller map of 1507 famously labeled South America as America after explorer Amerigo Vespucci, but it also included a vast western sea where the Pacific should be, a guess that happened to be right, though no European had seen it yet. Even genuine maps were riddled with intentional errors. Medieval Muslim cartographers sometimes distorted scales to emphasize Mecca's centrality. Chinese imperial maps omitted sensitive military routes. Portuguese navigators salted their charts with phantom islands to confuse competitors. These weren't mistakes, they were coded messages, cartographic chess moves in a high-stakes game of discovery and deception. The line between forgery and strategy blurred constantly. After all, when the known world was still half-shadowed in mystery, who could say for certain where truth ended and manipulation began? What these maps teach us isn't just about geography's dark arts, it's about human nature. We've always shaped reality to fit our needs, whether through ink on parchment or pixels on screens. The difference is that today we call it spin instead of here be dragons, but the impulse remains the same, to redraw the world not as it is but as we wish it to be. A compass rose isn't just a tool for navigation, it's a silent storyteller. Those intricate petals radiating across ancient maps carried more than directions. They whispered secrets about how civilizations saw themselves in the cosmos. Look closely at a medieval portolan chart, and you'll find the rose's arms often aligned not with true north, but with the magnetic north known to local sailors. This wasn't an error, it was a coded gift from cartographers to mariners, a way to say, here's how the sea speaks to us. Even the colors held meaning: gold for the sun's path, deep blue for sacred winds, sometimes blood red to mark treacherous currents. These weren't decorations, they were survival manuals in disguise. Then there were the wind faces, those cherubic figures puffing cheeks from cloud edges. Far from whimsical doodles, they embodied an entire philosophy. Greek maps showed Boreas, the north wind, as a bearded giant, his breath chilling the page, a warning of storms. Arab cartographers drew the Simum wind as a demon, its fiery exhalation scorching deserts. Each culture's wind faces revealed their deepest environmental fears, turning weather into mythology. When a 15th century Venetian map showed Zephyrus, the west wind, cradling ships gently toward shore, it wasn't just art, it was propaganda, assuring merchants that destiny itself favored their trade routes. Allegorical figures packed even heavier symbolism. Africa frequently appeared as a seated woman crowned with an elephant's head, a lion at her feet, not to honor the continent's wildlife, but to cement the European view of it as untamed and exotic. Asian rulers might be drawn holding spices or silk, reducing entire civilizations to their export goods. These weren't neutral portraits, they were visual arguments shaping how empires justified conquest. A single detail like Neptune straddling the Atlantic could imply divine sanction for naval dominance, while a tiny fortress sketched on a border might silently stake territorial claims. Even the humblest symbols hid agendas. Crosses atop mountains didn't just mark peaks, they flagged Christian conquests. Empty spaces labeled deserter often teemed with indigenous peoples, erased to justify colonial discovery. Cartographers wielded these symbols like diplomats, drawing not just landscapes but alliances and enemies into existence. When Spanish maps dotted the New World with golden cities, or Ottoman charts inked fortress icons along contested borders, they weren't documenting reality, they were scripting it. This visual language didn't just reflect power, it created it. The next time you unfold an ancient map, don't just follow its lines, listen to its whispers. Every lion, every gust of wind, every gilded compass point is a fragment of a lost conversation, one where geography wasn't just measured but meant something. And as we'll see, when maps stopped being just guides and started being weapons, that meaning turned into something far more dangerous. When Roman generals unfurled their itineraria, those practical scrolls marking every road, fort, and way station across the empire, they weren't just planning routes. They were performing an act of domination. Each inked line connecting Londinium to Alexandria whispered the same message: this land is measured, controlled, and owned. These weren't maps for travelers, they were blueprints of power, designed to move legions swiftly to crush rebellions and extract taxes with brutal efficiency. The Romans understood something revolutionary. A map doesn't just describe territory, it creates it. By standardizing place names and erasing local landmarks, their maps reforged diverse landscapes into a single imperial geography. A Celtic village became a dot labeled with its Latinized name. A sacred grove vanished entirely, replaced by symbols of Roman governance. This was conquest by parchment, proving that whoever holds the pen doesn't just record history, they write it. Half a world away, Chinese emperors wielded maps with even grander symbolism. The Yu Jai Tu, carved into stone in 1136, didn't merely show rivers and mountains, it choreographed the cosmos itself. Here, the empire sprawled at the center of a square earth, its borders aligning with celestial forces. Provincial capitals were plotted not just by distance, but by their harmony with the heavens. When envoys from tributary states saw their homelands reduced to tiny peripheral marks, the message was unmistakable. This was the Middle Kingdom, ordained by heaven to rule all under its gaze. Unlike Roman practicality, Chinese cartography was alchemy, transforming geography into divine mandate. Even the colors held power: imperial yellow for the emperor's domains, subdued blues for vassal territories, as if the very pigments enforced hierarchy. Then came the age when maps didn't just govern land, they invented it. In 1494, Pope Alexander VI drew a line down the Atlantic on the Treaty of Tordesillas map, dividing the entire unexplored world between Spain and Portugal. With a stroke of his quill, continents yet unseen were claimed, cultures not yet encountered were assigned to monarchs thousands of miles away. The arrogance was staggering, but the effect was undeniable. This wasn't cartography, it was conjuring, summoning empires out of empty ocean. Explorers like Cortés and Pizarro carried these fantasy maps like talismans, using their imaginary lines to justify the seizure of real gold, real land, real lives. When indigenous leaders protested, the conquerors would point to the parchment as if it were scripture proof that God and geography had already decided their fate. The legacy of these power plays lingers in every modern atlas. Mercator's projection, designed in 1569 to aid European sailors, accidentally made colonial powers like Britain appear vastly larger than equatorial nations, a distortion that still skews perceptions today. Time zones, first standardized by railroad empires, enforce a global clock centered on Greenwich. Even the simple act of placing north at the top of maps wasn't inevitable. Medieval Islamic maps often oriented southward toward Mecca, while some Chinese charts placed east at the pinnacle, the direction of sunrise and renewal. Our neutral maps are palimpsests, their layers whispering old stories of who ruled, who resisted, and who got to decide what the world looked like. Perhaps the most telling detail lies in what these maps erased. The Gangnedo map of 1402, one of Korea's greatest cartographic treasures, shows Africa with startling accuracy, yet omits all of Europe but its southern fringe. Was this ignorance or a quiet act of defiance against Eurocentric worldviews? Similarly, Polynesian stick charts, mapping ocean currents with knotted fibers, contained knowledge so vital that colonial powers banned them, fearing native navigators might outmaneuver their ships. Every choice what to include, what to exaggerate, what to omit was a chess move in the game of dominance. Today, when we open Google Maps without thinking, we're inheriting centuries of these silent battles where borders weren't discovered but drawn, often by the hands holding the sharpest pens or the sharpest swords. Claudius Ptolemy never saw the world as a flat disk surrounded by monsters. He saw it as a mathematician's puzzle waiting to be solved. In the 2nd century, when most maps still mixed geography with mythology, this Alexandrian scholar penned the Geographia, a work so revolutionary it would shape exploration for 1500 years. His genius wasn't in drawing coastlines, it was in devising a grid of latitude and longitude, a coordinate system that could place any city, mountain, or river with mathematical precision. Imagine the audacity. At a time when many believed the Earth's southern half was uninhabitable, Ptolemy calculated coordinates for over 8,000 locations, from the Canary Islands to the Malay Peninsula, using astronomical observations and traveler accounts. His maps weren't just pictures, they were equations rendered in ink. Yet the most fascinating twist in Ptolemy's story isn't his accuracy, it's his persistence. The original Geographia vanished during Europe's so-called Dark Ages, surviving only in Arabic translations. Then, in the 1400s, a Byzantine scholar brought a Greek copy to Italy, sparking a cartographic renaissance. Suddenly, mapmakers like Henricus Martellus and Martin Waldseemüller weren't guessing distances. They were scaling coastlines to Ptolemy's coordinates, treating his ancient text like gospel. His influence was everywhere. Columbus carried a Ptolemaic map when he sailed west, convinced Asia lay just beyond where Ptolemy had placed it. Vasco da Gama's navigators consulted updated versions when rounding Africa. For all its flaws, like underestimating Earth's circumference by nearly 20%, the Geographia became the closest thing the pre-modern world had to a global positioning system. What's striking is how Ptolemy's scientific rigor coexisted with lingering myths. Even as he dismissed tales of dog-headed men, his maps still marked the mountains of the moon as the Nile source, a legend borrowed from Herodotus. He rejected the idea that the Indian Ocean was landlocked, yet kept the mythical island of Taprobane, likely Sri Lanka, bloated to 10 times its true size. These weren't contradictions, they were compromises. Ptolemy worked with the best data available, but when evidence ran out, even he defaulted to tradition. His true legacy lies in the method, not the mistakes. For the first time, someone had treated cartography as a science, not just storytelling, and oh, how those mistakes endured. Ptolemy's miscalculation of Earth size made the Atlantic seem narrower, accidentally convincing Columbus that the Americas were Asia's eastern fringe. His elongated Mediterranean stretched nearly 20 degrees too far, threw off navigators for generations. Yet these errors became self-fulfilling prophecies, woven into so many maps that sailors adjusted their routes to match them. That's the paradox of Ptolemy's revolution. Even when he was wrong, he set the terms of the debate, proving that a flawed system rigorously applied can shape reality more than scattered truths. As we'll see, this tension between precision and tradition wouldn't fade with the Renaissance. It would explode into the age of exploration, where every corrected coordinate revealed just how much the world still had to teach its mapmakers. While Europe grappled with the superstitions of Imago Mundi, a revolution in precision was unfolding in the courts of Muslim rulers. Picture the scene, 12th century Palermo, where King Roger II of Sicily commissions a silver disc 6 feet wide, its surface etched with the known world in staggering detail. This wasn't just a map, it was the Tabula Rogeriana, the masterpiece of Arab geographer Muhammad al-Idrisi, who fused Greek astronomy, Persian mathematics, and first-hand accounts from traders who'd crossed deserts and seas. For the first time, a single document showed the Nile's true course, the curvature of the Indian coastline, and even hints of the African interior, all plotted with coordinates so precise they'd guide navigators for centuries. Al-Idrisi's genius lay in his method. Unlike medieval Europeans who placed faith above facts, he interviewed travelers at length, cross-referencing their stories with astronomical data. His team used astrolabes to calculate latitudes, measured shadows to gauge distances, and most radically treated the Earth as unquestionably spherical. The resulting map overturned ancient myths: no dragons at the edges, no biblical lands at the center. Instead, 7 climate zones stretched logically from equator to pole. Cities appeared where they actually stood, and trade routes traced accurate paths across continents. This was geography as science, not scripture, but the Islamic world's cartographic innovations didn't stop there. Take the Qibla compasses developed by 9th century scholars, ingenious devices that combined magnetic needles with prayer time calculations, allowing Muslims worldwide to face Mecca from any location. Or the Book of Curiosities, an 11th century Egyptian manuscript filled with star charts so precise they doubled as navigational guides for nighttime desert crossings. These weren't just tools, they were testaments to a culture that saw exploration and worship as intertwined. While European maps still showed Jerusalem as the spiritual center, Islamic cartographers proved the world was far vaster and far more measurable than previously believed. The irony, these breakthroughs quietly shaped Europe's age of exploration. When Columbus planned his westward voyage, he relied on maps inheriting Al-Idrisi's coordinates, though he disastrously misinterpreted them, believing Asia lay just beyond the Atlantic. Portuguese navigators like Vasco da Gama used Arab-invented astrolabes to sail around Africa, often following sea charts traced from captured Muslim vessels. Even the word azimuth, crucial for celestial navigation, comes directly from Arabic as sumat, the directions. The very tools that let Europe discover the globe were born from knowledge cultivated in Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba. Yet for all their accuracy, these maps held one last poetic secret. They still made room for wonder. Al-Idrisi included the legendary Fountain of Life in his Africa, and Persian atlases showed Mount Kaf, the mythical emerald home of the jinn. These weren't lapses in rigor, they were acknowledgments that some mysteries still danced beyond science's grasp. And as European ships began venturing into waters Arab cartographers had only hinted at, they'd confront a choice: cling to the old myths, or let the stars guide them toward truth stranger than any legend. Christopher Columbus never set out to discover a new world. He was searching for a shortcut. Armed with maps based on Ptolemy's ancient calculations and Marco Polo's exaggerated distances, he became convinced Asia lay just 3,400 miles west of Spain. The true distance was nearly 12,000. This wasn't just a minor miscalculation. It was a cartographic delusion that would alter history. When he stumbled upon the Caribbean in 1492, he didn't realize his error. To his dying day, Columbus insisted he'd reached the outer islands of Asia, forcing his crew to sign affidavits swearing Cuba was part of the Malay Peninsula. The maps in his mind were so powerful, they distorted the reality before his eyes. The consequences of this mistake rippled far beyond navigation. Columbus's Indies error triggered the Columbian Exchange, an unprecedented transfer of plants, animals, and diseases between hemispheres. Tomatoes from the Andes transformed Italian cuisine, while European horses revolutionized plains' indigenous cultures, but the exchange wasn't symmetrical. Smallpox, measles, and influenza, carried unwittingly by explorers, decimated native populations. Some estimates suggest 90% of the pre-Columbian Americas perished within a century of contact. This wasn't just demographic collapse, it was a cultural erasure as languages, traditions, and entire ways of understanding the world vanished with their speakers. Yet the most insidious fallout lay in the maps that followed. European cartographers, still clinging to Ptolemaic frameworks, began forcing the New World into Old World templates. The Caribbean became the West Indies, its islands mislabeled as Java or Ceylon. Aztec cities were drawn with spires resembling European cathedrals, while indigenous maps, like the Mexica's intricately folded amate paper codices, were destroyed as pagan objects. Every misplacement reinforced a dangerous idea that these lands were blank slates awaiting European definition, their true histories irrelevant to the conqueror's charts. Even the naming betrayed this bias. America itself comes from a later mapmaker's mistake walled Simula honoring the lesser-known Amerigo Vespucci over Columbus. Indigenous names like Turtle Island or Abyayola were erased, replaced by labels that reflected European ambitions rather than local realities. The very act of mapping became colonization by other means, with compass roses and latitude lines serving as the vanguard of empire. This collision of cartographic error and cultural arrogance set a pattern that would repeat for centuries. As explorers pushed deeper into continents, they carried not just sextants and parchment, but the unshakable belief that their outdated maps held more truth than the landscapes they encountered. And when the people they met described rivers that flowed backward or mountains that breathed fire, these accounts were dismissed as primitive myths, not because they were wrong, but because they didn't fit the lines already drawn on European charts. The tragedy wasn't just that Columbus got the distance wrong, it's that those who followed him refused to correct the course. The moment European ships breached the horizon of the New World, their maps began to bloom with fantasies. Cartographers who had never set foot across the Atlantic sketched golden cities where none existed, their pens guided by rumors rather than reality. The legend of El Dorado, a king who coated himself in gold dust, morphed into an entire empire shimmering in the South American jungles. Spanish conquistadors like Gonzalo Pizarro led thousands to their death searching for it, hacking through rainforests while local guides, bewildered by their obsession, tried in vain to explain that the story was a metaphor for spiritual renewal, not literal wealth. The maps told a different tale, marking lakes of gold and jeweled palaces with such conviction that men abandoned reason to chase them. Indigenous peoples, meanwhile, charted their world in ways that baffled European invaders. The Mexica drew maps on bark paper where distances stretched or shrank based on political alliances, not miles. A subject city might appear larger than its conqueror to honor its dignity, while rivers curved to show kinship between communities. The Incas' quipu knotted strings recording everything from taxes to myths included territorial claims, but these were less about borders than reciprocal obligations. Where Europeans saw empty spaces to conquer, native maps showed networks of relationships where a mountain wasn't just terrain but a living ancestor. The clash between these worldviews reached its cruelest irony in Florida. Juan Ponce de Leon's apocryphal search for the Fountain of Youth, a myth likely concocted after his death, inspired brutal expeditions through Timucua lands. The Timucua themselves had no need for such legends. Their maps, etched on shells, marked springs as sacred sites of healing, not because they reversed aging, but because they connected the physical and spiritual worlds. European maps erased these meanings, reducing entire cosmologies to X's marking imagined treasure. By the late 16th century, a quiet revolution began. Explorers like Samuel de Champlain, working with Algonquin guides, produced maps of New France that blended indigenous knowledge with European techniques. His charts of the St. Lawrence River noted not just depths and currents, but which tribes controlled which fishing grounds, a nod to the relational cartography he'd learned from people who knew the land intimately. Similarly, the Cantino planisphere of 1502, while still speckled with sea monsters, cautiously omitted El Dorado, its Portuguese makers opting for blank spaces over lies. This shift wasn't just about accuracy, it was about humility. As more Europeans spent years among native peoples, they began to see how their own maps had been prisons of expectation, blinding them to realities that didn't fit the myths. The true fountain of youth, it turned out, wasn't a spring. It was the wisdom of those who had long known the land, waiting for outsiders to finally listen. By the 18th century, the age of guesswork was giving way to an obsession with precision, an era where maps became not just navigational aids, but instruments of scientific conquest. Captain James Cook's voyages epitomized this shift. Armed with the newly perfected marine chronometer, a clock so accurate it could determine longitude at sea, Cook charted the Pacific with ruthless exactness. His maps of New Zealand's coastline were so precise they remained in use for over a century, their crisp lines erasing the speculative monsters that once swam in those waters. Yet Cook's work was more than technical triumph. It was an act of possession. Every bay named, every mountain measured, turned terra incognita into imperial real estate, a pattern repeated by explorers from La Pérouse to Lewis and Clark. Alexander von Humboldt took this precision inland, his barometers and sextants transforming South America's jungles into data points. His famous cross-section of Chimborazo volcano didn't just show altitude, it layered ecosystems like a cake, correlating plants with elevation in a way that birthed modern ecology. Humboldt's maps were revolutionary because they didn't just tell you where to go. They revealed how the world worked, stitching together climate, geology, and biology into a single, quantifiable tapestry. Yet even his rigor had blind spots. When indigenous guides described rivers that flowed backward during floods, Humboldt dismissed their accounts as superstition, missing a phenomenon now known as tidal bores, where ocean surges reverse freshwater currents. The tools enabling this accuracy were marvels of their age. Triangulation, the method of calculating distances by measuring angles between fixed points, allowed surveyors like the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India to map subcontinents with mathematical rigor. But these advancements came at a cost. The same triangulation networks that mapped India also facilitated British taxation systems, turning sacred groves into taxable lots. Mercator's projection, despite its navigational utility, grotesquely inflated the size of Europe and North America while shrinking Africa and South America, a distortion that still lingers in classrooms today. What's often forgotten is how much knowledge was steamrolled in this march toward precision. Polynesian star compasses, which had guided voyages across thousands of miles, were dismissed as primitive when European charts arrived. Inuit mental maps memorizing every crack and ridge of Arctic ice found no place in the ledger books of polar explorers. The very idea of accuracy became a cultural cudgel, privileging instruments over intuition, numbers over narratives. And then there were the silent casualties, the places left off the map entirely. When the U.S. Geological Survey began its topographic mapping in the 1870s, indigenous settlements were frequently omitted, deemed unimportant to the project of westward expansion. The same occurred in Australia, where Aboriginal songlines, ancient routes encoding stories and survival knowledge, were overwritten by the straight lines of property surveys. This wasn't just oversight, it was erasure, a reminder that every map is as much about what it excludes as what it includes. The irony is thick enough to cut with a theodolite. In their quest to banish the dragons of old maps, the new cartographers created monsters of their own systems so precise they could measure a mountain to the inch, yet so blind they couldn't see the people living on its slopes. As we'll discover, this tension between measurement and meaning would only deepen in the modern era, where satellites can scan every inch of the planet, but still struggle to capture the stories etched into its skin. Long before GPS grids and paper atlases, the Pacific Ocean was navigated by memory and intuition, by stories woven into sticks. Polynesian voyagers crafted intricate stick charts from palm ribs and shells, not to depict coastlines but to map the ocean's hidden language. Each curve represented swell patterns disrupted by distant islands, every knot marked where stars aligned over specific atolls. These weren't just maps, they were mnemonics, encoding generations of knowledge about currents, winds, and the habits of birds that led to land. When European explorers marveled at finding inhabited islands in this vast blue desert, they missed the truth. The empty seas had been thoroughly charted, just in a language outsiders couldn't read. Half a world away, Inuit hunters carried mental maps of Arctic ice so precise they could navigate blizzards by the feel of snow underfoot. They memorized pressure ridges that signaled thin ice, wind-carved contours that pointed to sealed breathing holes, even the sound of currents beneath the frozen surface. To draw these routes on paper would have been unthinkable. The ice shifted daily, and survival depended on reading its ever-changing story. European maps of the same regions, with their static coastlines and blank white interiors, failed to capture this dynamic relationship between people and environment. The Inuit weren't lost, they were listening to a landscape that whispered its secrets to those who knew how to hear. These systems shared a radical idea, that maps could be living, evolving narratives rather than fixed snapshots. Aboriginal Australian songlines wove geography with creation myths, where every rock and waterhole held a verse in an epic poem spanning the continent. To follow a songline wasn't just to travel, it was to reenact ancestral journeys, with landmarks serving as prompts for verses that guided the way. Similarly, pre-colonial Mesoamerican maps painted on deerskin folded time and space together, showing conquests alongside sacred events, as if history itself were a terrain to navigate. The tragedy is how much of this knowledge was dismissed or deliberately destroyed in the name of progress. British colonizers banned Polynesian navigation, forcing islanders to rely on foreign charts. Soviet officials confiscated Inuit sled dogs, severing the bond between hunters and ice. Yet fragments survived, often in unexpected ways. When modern scientists compared Marshallese stick charts to satellite data, they found the wave patterns matched oceanographic models with eerie accuracy. Inuit elders today collaborate with climatologists, their ancestral ice knowledge proving crucial for understanding Arctic warming. What these traditions reveal is a different kind of wisdom, one that sees maps not as tools of control, but as conversations with the world. They remind us that every culture charts space through the lens of its values, whether that's the Polynesian focus on relationships between elements or the Inuit emphasis on sensory attunement. Even our sleek digital maps, with their algorithmic routes and real-time traffic updates, echo ancient impulses to predict, to find patterns, to feel at home in the unknown. The difference is that we've traded stories for satellites, forgetting that the best maps don't just show us where we are, they tell us who we've been and who we might become. Today's maps can pinpoint your location within inches, summon a 3D model of your childhood home with a tap, even track storms moving across oceans in real time, yet something surprising has happened in this age of digital perfection. The colder our maps become in their precision, the more we crave the warmth of human touch. GPS satellites orbit silently overhead, stitching together images so sharp they can count cars in a parking lot, but we still buy hand-drawn city maps framed as art. Google Earth lets us fly over any street on the planet, yet online forums buzz with people sharing antique atlases, tracing the elegant swirls of 16th century compass roses with their fingers. This isn't just nostalgia, it's a rebellion against the idea that maps should be purely functional. The irony is that our hyper-accurate digital tools have resurrected the very thing they were supposed to replace: storytelling. Open Google Maps and you'll find layers of crowdsourced labels, local diners nicknamed "Where we had our first date," hiking trails marked "Spot where the bear stole my sandwich." These aren't coordinates, they're modern-day versions of those medieval sea monsters, personal myths scribbled onto the grid. Meanwhile, platforms like OpenStreetMap turn cartography into a global collaboration, where villagers in Kenya can map their own footpaths rather than waiting for satellites to notice them. The spirit of those Polynesian stick charts lives on in this participatory urge to make maps that reflect how we experience places, not just how satellites photograph them. And then there's the artistic revival. Artists like Paula Scher paint cityscapes where subway lines morph into neon rivers, their distortions somehow feeling truer than transit apps. The British Library recently digitized centuries of hand-painted maps, their faded pigments and margin notes drawing more online viewers than the library's sleek GIS displays. Even the military has taken note. The U.S. Army trains soldiers in sketch mapping, recognizing that a hastily drawn dirt road with "enemy here" scribbled in pencil can be more valuable than a tablet loaded with satellite images. But perhaps the most telling twist is how old myths keep creeping back into our sterile digital landscapes. Zoom in on remote areas of Google Earth, and you'll still find comments debating the location of Atlantis or El Dorado. Online communities dissect NASA images for signs of lost civilizations with the same fervor that medieval scholars poured over Ptolemy's errors. The difference is that now, the dragons wear new disguises. Conspiracy theorists mark UFO landing sites on digital globes, while crypto enthusiasts overlay blockchain coordinates onto old pirate treasure maps. The lesson is clear. We may have banished the paper and ink, but we haven't outgrown the human need to fill blank spaces with meaning. Our tools have changed, but the urge remains, to not just navigate the world, but to enchant it. And as we'll see, that enchantment is taking forms the old mapmakers could never have dreamed. Middle-earth sprawls across our screens with the same intricate detail as a medieval Imago Mundi, and that's no accident. J.R.R. Tolkien didn't just write a fantasy epic. He drew its maps first, inking mountains with the same care medieval monks reserved for Jerusalem, sketching elvish script along forest borders like the Latin labels on ancient parchments. His creation taps into something primal, The same hunger that made sailors swear by sea monsters now makes us trace the paths of hobbits through the Shire, as if these imaginary contours could lead us home. Fantasy cartography has become its own art form, from the ink-stained pages of Dungeons and Dragons manuals to the glowing overworld maps of video games like Elden Ring. These aren't just guides, they're invitations to believe, proving we still crave the enchantment our ancestors wove into their atlases. Yet the urge to mythologize geography isn't confined to fiction. Flat Earth theories, despite flying in the face of centuries of evidence, mimic the same cognitive dissonance that kept Ptolemy's errors alive for generations. When believers point to missing curvature in amateur photos or cite Antarctic ice walls as the world's edge, they're replaying the medieval instinct to distrust the unknown. The psychological pull is identical. It's comforting to imagine the universe has firm borders, just as it soothed ancient sailors to picture dragons marking the limits of safe passage. Even the language echoes the past. YouTube conspiracy threads now chant, "Here be dragons," about government cover-ups, turning a 600-year-old cartographic phrase into a meme for modern paranoia. Urban legends continue this tradition with eerie precision. The vanishing California island, on some GPS apps, a glitch caused by outdated survey data, sparked tales of a hidden landmass erased by shadowy elites. Online forums dissect satellite images for the lost city of Atlantis, with the same fervor Renaissance scholars once debated the location of Prester John's kingdom. And just as old maps used decorative compass roses to signal authority, today's viral maps of secret subway tunnels or haunted ley lines gain credibility through aesthetic touches, weathered filters, faux parchment textures, the occasional Gothic font. The packaging changes, but the human craving for mystery stays stubbornly the same. What's revealing is how these modern myths cluster around gaps in our supposedly all-knowing digital maps. Google Earth's blurry patches over military bases birthed theories about alien hangars. The Bermuda Triangle resurfaced as a TikTok trend precisely because marine GPS logs show real anomalies there, not supernatural ones, but electromagnetic glitches that make ships vanish from screens momentarily. Our tools have gotten sharper, but our brains still fill blank spaces with stories, turning glitches into folklore and pixels into prophecies. So how do we re-enchant our maps without retreating into fantasy? Artists and technologists are already answering. Augmented reality apps overlay neighborhood streets with historical photos or indigenous place names, layering time like a palimpsest. Community mapping projects from Nairobi to New Orleans train residents to document unofficial footpaths and gathering spots, reclaiming geography from satellites. Even NASA has joined in, crowdsourcing names for Martian craters from global mythologies, a nod to the ancient practice of tying landscapes to stories. The future of mapping might lie in balancing precision with poetry, letting latitude and legend coexist. After all, if a medieval monk could sketch paradise at the edge of a calfskin parchment, who's to say we can't find magic in the grid lines of a smartphone screen? Grayson Perry's tapestries don't just hang on walls, they unravel the very idea of borders. In his 2012 series The Vanity of Small Differences, the British artist stitched sprawling, medieval-style maps where motorways twist into DNA helixes and council estates loom like fortified castles. The effect is both nostalgic and subversive. His cartographic mashups expose how modern class divisions echo the feudal hierarchies of old Imago Mundi. Perry isn't merely borrowing antique aesthetics. He's weaponizing them, using the visual language of authority to question who gets left off today's metaphorical maps. AI Huawei takes this further, transforming maps into monuments of displacement. His Law of the Journey installation featured a massive rubber boat crowded with faceless figures, floating atop a floor map of the Mediterranean. The piece didn't just depict refugee routes, it forced viewers to physically walk across the same waters where thousands have drowned, turning abstract borders into visceral experiences. Like Renaissance cartographers who drew sirens to symbolize oceanic dangers, Huawei uses symbolism to confront uncomfortable truths. His maps aren't guides, they're accusations. Meanwhile, artist activists like Maria Achakacha resurrect the tradition of mapmaking as protest. Her Womankind series reimagines continents as female silhouettes, their borders defined by historical struggles rather than treaties. South America stretches into a raised fist, Africa's outline dissolves into a crowd of demonstrators, a direct challenge to the colonial boundaries still etched on modern atlases. These works echo the medieval practice of centering maps on holy sites, but here, the sacred isn't a place, it's justice. Even traditional materials get radical makeovers. Ethiopian-American artist Julie Maritulayers deconstructed city grids with explosions of color, creating maps that look like they're mid-collapse or rebirth. Her canvases evoke the chaos of ancient sea charts, but instead of monsters, the voids swarm with echoes of police sirens and protest chants. It's cartography as archaeology, digging through layers of power and resistance. What unites these artists is their refusal to let maps be neutral. They've inherited the old mapmakers' flair for storytelling, but redirected it, replacing dragons with data, swapping paradise for pipelines. As we hurtle toward an era of AI-generated terrain and augmented reality overlays, their work begs a vital question. Will future maps continue to hide behind the myth of objectivity, or will they finally admit what the ancients knew all along? That every line we draw is a choice, and every blank space an invitation to dream or disrupt. Imagine slipping on a VR headset and stepping onto the surface of Mars, not as a static image, but as a living, breathing landscape mapped in real time by AI-driven rovers. This isn't science fiction, it's the next frontier of cartography. As virtual reality and artificial intelligence collide with traditional mapmaking, we're witnessing a revolution as profound as Ptolemy's first coordinate grid. NASA Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter already streams terrain data to Earth, where algorithms stitch it into immersive 3D worlds. But here's the twist, these aren't just scientific tools. Private companies are selling virtual land on Mars, parceling out digital coordinates to eager buyers. Suddenly, we're back to the age of speculative geography, where maps aren't just records, they're commodities, and the lines between exploration and exploitation blur like never before. Climate change is rewriting our planet's atlas even faster than AI can track it. Satellite images of Greenland's melting ice sheets update so frequently that traditional paper maps can't keep pace. In response, cartographers are borrowing from medieval playbooks using color gradients reminiscent of ancient illuminated manuscripts to show ice loss over time, turning hard data into visceral storytelling. Indigenous communities are leading the charge here, blending drone surveys with oral histories to create dynamic maps of shifting coastlines. The Tlingit people of Alaska, for example, overlay traditional fishing grounds onto real-time glacial retreat models, proving that the most cutting-edge climate maps might just be those that listen to the oldest voices. Yet for all our tech, the ethical questions loom larger than any mountain range. When Google Earth captures high-resolution images of indigenous sacred sites without consent, or when AI-generated property maps displace nomadic tribes by formalizing ancestral lands, we're repeating the sins of colonial cartographers with fancier tools. The UN now warns of digital colonization as corporations patent algorithms that claim to discover resources on indigenous territories, a high-tech echo of the doctrine of discovery that justified land grabs centuries ago. Even in space, the stakes are surreal. Lunar mapping startups are already selling naming rights for craters, while Elon Musk's Starlink satellites literally redraw the night sky for astronomers. Perhaps that's why some futurists argue we're circling back to symbolic mapping, as we prepare to chart exoplanets and ocean worlds where no human eye has seen the terrain. We might rely less on photorealism and more on the language of myth, just as medieval cartographers did. NASA proposed Mars Perseverance game already lets players navigate the red planet using abstract hazard symbols instead of literal images. Meanwhile, artists like Agnes Dean's plant Fibonacci spiral forests in melting Arctic zones, merging mathematical precision with ecological protest. These aren't retreats from accuracy, they're acknowledgements that some truths can't be captured by satellites alone. In the end, the future of maps might look startlingly like their past, not in their tools, but in their soul. Whether we're sketching melting coastlines or virtual Mars colonies, we're still wrestling with the same questions ancient mapmakers faced. Who gets to define reality? What do we choose to include or exclude? And how do we navigate a world that's always half known? The parchment has become pixels, the sea monsters have morphed into data glitches, but the human hunger to make meaning from the unknown remains unchanged. As we stand on the brink of mapping other worlds, we do well to remember the lessons whispered by those old, imperfect charts, that every map is a mirror, and what it reflects says more about us than the ground beneath our feet. Ancient maps were never just lines on parchment. They were humanity's first attempts to stitch meaning into the unknown. Every dragon at the edge of the world, every golden city sketched in the margins, whispered the same truth. We don't just map what we see, we map what we long to believe. These fragile documents survived wars, fires, and centuries not because they were accurate, but because they were alive, pulsing with the fears, dreams, and stubborn curiosity of the people who drew them. The Hereford Imago Mundi's Jerusalem-centered cosmos, the Polynesian stick charts' wave songs, even Ptolemy's stubborn errors that guided explorers astray, they all reveal something timeless. Geography was never the point was the story and what stories they told. A single phrase like, "Here be dragons," wasn't a warning, it was an admission. It said, beyond this line, our knowledge fails, but our imagination soars. Those empty spaces on the map weren't voids, they were stages where humanity's greatest dramas played out. The quest for El Dorado, the search for the Northwest Passage, even the modern hunt for dark matter, they're all the same impulse wearing different clothes. We've swapped parchment for pixels, but we're still those sailors squinting at horizons, aching to fill the blanks with something wondrous. That's why these old maps still haunt us. They prove that every exploration, every scientific leap, begins not with data, but with desire. When Columbus misread his charts and found a continent instead of Asia, when Al-Idrisi placed the fountain of youth beside real African rivers, they weren't failing. They were doing what humans do best, reaching beyond what's known, guided by equal parts logic and legend. The irony, we laugh at their mistakes, yet we repeat them. Our GPS still leads us down dead ends. Our satellites still miss the hidden trails only locals know. The tools change, but the dance between truth and myth goes on. So here's the real secret. The world doesn't come with edges until we draw them. Those ancient cartographers knew it. Their maps were never finished, always waiting for the next traveler's tale to shift a coastline or banish a monster. Now it's your turn. What uncharted places still linger in your life? What modern dragons lurk at the edges of your understanding? Maybe it's the buried histories of your hometown, the constellations your phone can't name, or the stories woven into the land beneath your feet. Grab them, sketch them, because every map, from the oldest clay tablet to the newest algorithm, started the same way, with someone daring to say, "What if?" The parchment's in your hands now. What will you draw? Drop your favorite map mysteries below. The stranger, the better. After all, the next great adventure might begin with a comment section rumor. Who's to say your words won't send someone searching? History's proved it before. Today's wild guess could be tomorrow's discovery. Just ask the guy who thought he'd find Asia and stumbled onto a new world in